the April meeting of the Public Works Committee. Call the meeting to order. All committee members, with the exception of Councilmember Burke, are participating in person. Under the North Carolina General Statutes, this meeting is treated as a virtual or remote meeting and is being streamed live. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized and state their vote. Please have the clerk recall the roll. Committee's members are Councilmember Barbara Haynes Burke, Vice Chair, Councilmember John Larson, Councilmember Annette Scipio, and myself, Councilmember McIntosh. Do we need to do a roll call? Okay.
Councilmember Burke.
Here.
Councilmember Larson.
Present.
Councilmember Scipio.
Present.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Here. Thank you. I would ask committee members, council members, whether there are any items on the consent agenda that they would like pulled for discussion.
C1 and C3.
C1, C3. Any others? Only one really left. Okay, I would entertain a motion.
I move. Go ahead, John.
I move approval of the balance of the consent agenda.
Second.
Very good. If we could have roll call, please.
Councilmember Burke.
Yes.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Aye. Okay, if the clerk would read C1, please.
Item C1, resolution approving an agreement with the Cliffdale Woods Homeowners Association for decorative street lighting.
And it looks like we have Miss Danique McCullough to enlighten us on this.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for having me tonight. This item is related to Homeowners Association request to have improved street lighting in their neighborhood, and it's consistent with our policy, which allows them to have upgraded lighting, and they pay the upcharges if council approves the agreement. And I can answer any questions that you might have related to this
Councilmember Scipio.
item.
Yes. Good evening, and how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Wonderful. I just had a question on the map that was included, just to make sure I was reading it correctly. Is the blue area the Cliffdale Woods neighborhood? It's inside of other areas there. So is that blue map the neighborhood?
Yes, ma'am, that was to indicate the neighborhood. Yes, ma'am.
That was.
Okay, if there are no further questions, can I get a motion and a second?
I move for approval of C1.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Second.
We have 2 seconds. Okay, if clerk would call the roll, please. Thank you, Ms. McCullough.
Councilmember Burke.
Yes.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
And Councilmember McIntosh.
Aye. If we could have item C3, please.
Item C3, resolution fixing date for public hearing on a petition to close and abandon a portion of Midway Road and notice to all persons thereof interested in the closing.
Assistant City Manager King.
Good afternoon, Chairman McIntosh, council members. Sandy, do you mind pulling up that the map for this item, the one that's probably labeled utilities? Okay, so this is a petition to close that unimproved right-of-way that you see there, kind of hatched out in red. This is just north of Midway Road. So if you were to zoom out a couple clicks, Box Mountain Road would be to the left of this area. And so as you can see, there's no road located within that area shown in red. There's no public utilities there. If it's closed, basically half of that right-of-way would be given to each of the adjacent property owners. Staff has reviewed this, and we do recommend approval of this request.
Thank you. Any questions from council?
My question was, that red area is a road that's not a road. It's not an easement, though.
It's a piece of land that was dedicated or offered for as public right-of-way. There's never been an actual street constructed or put within it, so it's just undeveloped land. And we have quite a few of these paper right-of-ways within our city.
And when I was looking at this, my question was, how would that homeowner or the landowner have access to that land if they were to do something in the future?
So I believe the petitioner are the Chisholms, and they own that northern, the furthest house there on Midway on the north side, the very last one. So this would adjoin their property.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Larson?
Just a nomenclature question. Is there a difference in the planning department between the term closure and abandonment?
It's the same. I think we've basically used that same terminology whenever we brought these through. So typically the abandoned piece is if there's any kind of roadway or any utilities within there. In this case, it really is a closure. We're taking that right away and we are closing it should City Council approve this.
A closure will transfer the ownership to adjacent property owners?
That's correct.
And abandonment does the same thing?
Well, what we would typically say is if there was a road within there, we would close it and then we would abandon the maintenance of the road. But there's no road in this one.
Got it. Thank you.
If there are no further questions, could I get a motion and a second?
Move approval.
Second, Burke.
A motion and a second. Clerk will call the roll.
Councilmember Burke,
Yes.
Councilmember Larson,
Yes.
Councilmember Scipio,
Yes.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Aye. Okay, that brings us to general agenda. Have the first item, please.
Item G1, fertilizer plant zoning regulations, research, and recommendations.
Looks like we have Mr. Smotherman who's going to give our presentation, or Mr. Murphy.
Good evening, council members. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you did realize that Steve Smotherman will give the presentation for this, and we're here to also answer any questions if we can provide any assistance.
Thank you, sir.
Well, good evening, Councilmember McIntosh, Councilmember Burke, and the other members of the council on this committee. I'm going to talk briefly. I trained to be less than 5 minutes in any presentation that I do, so I'll try to be very brief. We looked at, as you know, the Winston Weaver plant fire provided the impetus for us to assess our current land use regulations for fertilizer manufacturing facilities. And so we researched how peer cities in our state address fertilizer plants through their zoning regulations. And we looked at the peer cities we looked at were Charlotte, Durham, Fayetteville, Greensboro, and Raleigh. Next slide, please. And our director, Chris Murphy, did some research and was very interesting, found in the 1951 aerials, which are on the left slide, what it would look like in 1951. And then you see the same area on the slide on the right side, shows it from aerial photography from 2018, and you certainly can see what the different 70 years makes as far as urbanization and development around the plant. The plant was built in 1939 and opened in 1940, and at that time, our state population was a lot less than it was today, so counties do not have the authority to establish zoning ordinances at that time. In 1964, the Winston Weaver plant was annexed by Winston-Salem, and industrial zoning for the property was established. In 1967, Forsyth County did adopt a zoning ordinance, although they, as early as 20 years earlier, had the authority to do so. But that's sort of the history of the property. As far as our current UDO and how we treat fertilizer plants, they are classified as chemical manufacturing based on the North American Industrial Classification System, or NAICS. Chemical manufacturing is one of 13 uses classified as manufacturing C, which is only allowed in the most intensive general industrial zoning district. A couple of the other uses are battery manufacturing, metal production, and rubber and plastic manufacturing. Also, any use that involved the manufacture of hazardous materials is prohibited within 1 mile of Salem Lake by the watershed protection regulations. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the peer cities, they all only allowed fertilizer plants in their most intensive industrial district. And they classified it either some form of chemical manufacturing or high impact and hazardous manufacturing. And many of them had some additional use restrictions. Durham and Greensboro require approval of a special use permit by the elected body. Almost all of them had enhanced setbacks from residential that ranged from 300 feet to 1,500 feet. Durham and Greensboro, whose ordinances were almost identical, also required a perimeter security wall or fence. And Durham and Fayetteville required that there be a hazardous materials management plan to be submitted as part of the site plan approval. And finally, 4 of the peer cities, 3 peer cities in Winston-Salem all had water supply watershed restrictions. I mentioned Winston's. Greensboro prohibits hazardous materials plants within 1/2 mile of any water supply source. And Durham and Fayetteville require that anybody that's going to deal with hazardous materials as part of their approval submit a spill containment plan. Next slide, please. And this gives you a quick overview of the different regulations from the different communities. Next slide, please. Other possible fertilizer plant restrictions were some of them that we have that we deal for hazardous waste management facilities, which requires a minimum site size. And that may make sense given if there's additional setbacks required from residential. It also requires that any building for that use have a 200-foot setback from any property line, and that it'd be 1/4 mile setback from residential or institutional zoning districts. And another thing we saw in a couple of instances was requiring fertilizer plant to be a minimum distance separation from large places of assembly, such as schools, universities. Next slide, please. And so our recommendations kind of follow from the research. There are many different options that exist for improving the UDO regulations or enhancing them with regard to chemical manufacturing facilities. Should council determine that such options are warranted through a UDO text amendment, again requiring these options include requiring an elected body special use permit, requiring a minimum site size, enhancing setbacks and buffers from residential districts, adding a spacing requirement from school and universities, requiring a security wall or fence, and requiring submission of a hazardous materials management plan for review by local fire and EMS agencies as part of any site plan approval. Next slide, please. And lastly, we need to be coordination with building and fire code officials in any preparation of a text amendment to make sure that we're complementary and not contradicting one another. But the building and fire codes also have regulations that will further lessen the impacts of fertilizer plant facilities through limits on the amount of hazardous products stored on site, requirements on how the product is stored, sprinklers, and other fire suppression systems. And they would be able to provide you with any more detail on those areas that would be involved in construction of a new fertilizer plant facility. And that is it, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions you may have.
First, before we get into questions, I would like to ask City Attorney, can you give a brief overview of the Dillon Rule and whether, in your opinion, anything that is proposed by staff here would run afoul of our ability to enact an ordinance like this or change our ordinance like this?
Essentially, with the Dillon Rule, what you're looking for is whether or not there's statutory authority for what you are proposing to do. And I know in terms of the building code and fire code, quite often we have to look at specifically whether or not there's authority for us to do what it is that we want to do and whether or not we need to get authorization from those councils as to whether or not we can enact something that really exceeds the existing authority. A good example of that is the fact some years ago, the city of Winston-Salem put in place an ordinance that required a sprinkler system in existing buildings. It was determined by the court that the ordinance exceeded the city's statutory authority, and therefore we could not enact and enforce such an ordinance. So again, with Dillon's rule, you're looking for whether or not there's statutory authority for what you propose to do, and if there isn't, then you have to go about the process of getting that authority either through the Building Code Council or directly from the General Assembly.
Have you had a chance to look through staff recommendations here and form an opinion on it?
Not on the specific recommendations, but I certainly will do that.
Okay, I would imagine, staff is aware of that rule, and I would imagine they would have that in mind when they made these suggestions, but I would appreciate your input on that.
Sure.
Staff, questions from council members? Councilmember Burke? Sandy's trying to signal me here.
You need to speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. You want to repeat everything I just said? Okay, do I have questions from council members?
Mr. Chairman,
Councilmember Larson.
under these new guidelines or rules, ordinances, can the Weaver plant be rebuilt at its current location?
It depends on what's adopted. We're just listing options right now.
It's a pretty clear roadmap of regulations and guidelines to protect the neighborhood and the citizens in the vicinity. And clearly, this particular plant was built many years ago. You look at the maps, I mean, there's nothing there initially. Not the case anymore. I'm not sure they can get 10 acres. I mean, if that's...
The current plan is not. It's about 8.5 acres.
Yeah.
So again, the example we put out was just just an example, and it'd have to be, anything we propose would go
Is this
through.
going to require a public hearing as well?
I mean, if you're talking about amending the UDO, that certainly would require a public hearing, but I think in terms of the recommendations, in terms of what the committee wants to pursue of those recommendations, we'll have to look and see what authority there exists for those and whether or not a specific public hearing is required. But usually with the UDO changes, certainly they require a public hearing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes. I'm just curious about what the next step is.
Well, I think I'll defer to Aaron and see what staff has in mind.
I would kind of characterize this a little bit of kind of how we brought information on the social district. We're kind of throwing this out for information, and if this is something that the committee wants staff to pursue, give us a direction, we can go back and research and come back with some specific recommendations to see if we're hitting the mark or not. If you're not interested, tell us.
And just to follow up, one of the things that we want to make sure on the last slide to point out again is as the Public Works Committee serves as the task force on the Weaver fire, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, I believe that perhaps Emergency Management and Forsyth County Environmental Health will be here to speak to you next month, and then we would hope that in June maybe have some fire plan review folks and building plan review folks who could come in and also talk to you about one of the things that we're concerned about is we don't want to be overzealous and overly restrictive on the zoning regulations if there are regulations in place in the current building code and the current fire code that would allay some of these concerns related to the amount of materials that could be stored, how they had to be stored, what the fire suppression system would be that may address some of these concerns that weren't in place for this facility that was built in 1939. So again, this is just information. It would probably be wise for the committee to receive this and receive the information you receive from the other folks that are going to come talk to you, and then perhaps at a later time formulate your kind of laundry list of things you would like for us to further investigate to then bring back to the committee for a recommendation to the council for a text amendment, if that's what you desire to do.
Thank you.
And that could be a text amendment or an amendment to the code itself as well, because there are building regulations in the code as well that may need to be amended, depending upon what it is you want, ultimately decide you want to do.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Scipio.
Mr. Murphy, I have a question I think you can answer. I know this presumes or takes into consideration if a fertilizer plant were to build in our community now. So that's sort of like, if you want to come here, that this is what our rules could be. That's what we're talking about. Do any of our current codes protect industries that are already here and someone's trying to build? So for instance, if the fertilizer plant was still in place and someone wanted to build a housing development, are there restrictions for a developer that they would have to honor to protect the existing industry? Do we have any of that?
No, ma'am.
Oh, but we could do something like that to protect those that are already here, having restrictions like you can't build 10 feet closer to this plant or in this area.
You can. One of the things that's difficult, I mean, it's easy whenever we're looking at doing restrictions for a industry or for a entity. You know, we have spacing requirements for group homes. We have spacing requirements for homeless shelters. The inverse of that is difficult, where you have a homeless shelter or you have, you know, some group home, or in this case, if we had a setback for manufacturing C, a subset of that for chemical manufacturing, it's hard to then, you know, tell someone that if they have a piece of property that's zoned appropriately for a house, you can't put a house there. So I think that's what you're getting to. Are there ways that we could protect that industry if we were to adopt some of these regulations? And the answer to that question is we could, but then you may be taking away rights from folks that they already have, and it may get into a situation where we would be, essentially it would be a taking. They wouldn't have any other reasonable use of the property, and I'll defer to the attorney on that.
I agree that could be an issue, and then I know you may have an issue of amortization as well and other things you'll have to take into consideration when you're talking about taking existing rights away. So,
Even if they're for the greater good of the public, if that's it, okay. But it's something that we should possibly think in terms of if we're going to protect certain industries, because anything could be a hazard at any particular time, just depending on what happens.
I mean, yeah, I think it certainly doesn't hurt to be part of the discussion, but whenever we're looking at implementing rules and regulations, we have to make sure that those rules and regulations that we do implement are enforceable and that it's something that we can catch. And then also looking at the impacts of what those rules and regulations are, and if they do take away property rights, if they do essentially take away any reasonable use of the property, then the city would theoretically be on the hook to have to compensate that property owner.
Thank you.
I think the best approach, again, as Aaron has mentioned, is to listen to the various disciplines and so forth, and maybe come up with your ideas, and we'll just have to look at them from a practical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, and all other avenues, and inform you later on which of those you can do based upon existing authority, which of those you can't do and may require enabling legislation or building code council amendment or something of that nature, and those which you can't do because they're not legal. So.
Councilmember Larson.
I think one of the things that the public's most concerned about is there another fertilizer plant type example out there somewhere that we should be worried about? I mean, obviously, we're spending some effort here to preclude any new occurrences or any new implantment of these kinds of problems. But do we have, is this probably a question maybe for the fire chief or somebody else to answer rather than planning? But I think one of the questions I've been asked is, well, how many more of these are out there that we should be worried about?
Well, right, and again, I think that would probably be a good idea to probably ask the fire officials when they're here. Obviously, they have pre-plans on a lot of buildings and facilities we have, you know, within Winston-Salem. Obviously, there are hazards on every corner whenever you look at, underground storage tanks for, service stations and those kind of things. If you look at basically any type of manufacturing facility, they're going to have some type of chemicals on site that potentially could be hazardous. A lot of it just depends on when the facilities were constructed, under what building codes they were constructed under, that determines how things are stored, and then also looks at kind of the fire suppression systems that are on site. But yeah, it wouldn't be surprising to know that there are things all over the city that have the potential to be dangerous. But again, it's one of those things, it's kind of like looking at trade-offs, what the
We used to have a system of marking buildings. I haven't seen that recently, that had hazardous material listings and.
Yeah, and again, that's part of the fire code, and there are things that they do as far as whenever they occupy buildings, whenever they permit buildings. But again, there are things out there that are potentially hazardous everywhere within the city. It's just, do they rise to this level? And it really depends on the type of, chemicals they have, and again, what type of fire suppression systems and things they have in place, and when those facilities were built.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's important that we move with some speed on this. We do not want that plant rebuilt there. And so I think it's upon us to make this a relatively speedy process to make some changes that would make that impossible. If they were to rebuild, they would have to undergo the same set of regulations and building codes of today. They would not be able to grandfather what they had there previously.
Correct. Right. Let's say they were to come in tomorrow for a permit, and again, I don't know that they're going to, but let's just say that they did. They would be able to locate there based on the regulations that are in the GI district today. But the actual building permit, plan review, fire code review, they would have to meet today's building code for the storage of the materials, the amount of materials that could be stored, the fire suppression systems, the type of construction. All those things would have to be met today if they were to come in the door. But you are correct. If the end goal is to try to protect that site and make sure that something, we would have to move forward, and that, maybe one of the things, I don't know. Yes, we would have to move forward to prevent it from rebuilding there.
And one of the issues with that is that there were already regulations in place about reporting on inventory, which this company did not do for 2 years. So we were in the dark. We were blind as to what was on that site, essentially. We had no regulatory ability to go force them to turn over materials. And I think we would continue to be that in that situation, even if somebody rebuilt with current building regulations. So my question is going to be to the fire department, give us an inventory of the industries that we should also be concerned about. And how do we, and this probably has to be done through the state, but we need to have some mechanism being able to put some teeth into a requirement of having that inventory turned over. Because if people can just ignore it, we're going to continue to be at risk.
There are certain reporting requirements that were not met by the Weaver plant facility in terms of in a timely manner. And so we are looking at what authority we have locally when they don't meet those requirements to force them to basically comply with like the tier 2 reporting requirements and so forth. So we are looking at that.
And that will be an after the fact thing if there's an issue, if there's a real issue like this one. So I think we need to be proactive on the front end and take care of it through the staff recommendations. One thing to Councilmember Scipio's point about somebody building something nearby that's residential that would be hazardous. If a property were to request rezoning to a multifamily, that's a public process, or we could have input on whether or not that was a good idea. So if a petitioner came forth and said, I got RS9, I want to go to RM18 or some other thing, there would be a way for public safety to speak to that, as well as council members or the general public.
Correct. If they have to go through the rezoning process, if you had a vacant piece of property that was already zoned RM and it would accommodate 300 units, there wouldn't be any type of public discourse, and there wouldn't be any type of public hearing type decision, because again, the zoning would already be in place. It would go through a plan review through permitting and get a permit issued. But yes, if they wanted to request a rezoning, obviously there would be public discourse and that could be discussed as part of the analysis.
Great. Okay, committee, have I got any suggestions on how to proceed on this? Would like to see staff formalize this more, come back with specific suggestions?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think I'd like to hear from the fire department at a separate briefing, as well as maybe the
Yep.
emergency management about their perception of how to deal with these issues. And then quickly, hopefully, we can get maybe even both of them in one meeting. And so I do agree there's a certain sense of urgency on this.
Okay. Can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I do think there's a certain sense of urgency on this, and that maybe we can get emergency management and the fire department to quickly bring their information forward.
So,
Mr. King?
so I want to make sure I'm hearing that correctly. So the plan was to probably bring Keith Huff in next month to talk about some of the environmental issues. If I'm hearing you correctly, the idea would be to switch up the batting order and try to bring emergency management and fire next month.
That would be good. That would suit me.
I'm thinking more of a parallel track. I would really like to have the land use side of it addressed as quickly as possible. I think some of the other things don't have to be done sort of sequentially, or they can be done sequentially.
So I think that's a good point, Chairman McIntosh. Remember that process to develop a zoning text amendment takes a while because of the steps that are involved. Staff's got to do the research. We've got to come up with the recommendations. You got to go through planning board, hold a public hearing, then it comes back through committee, and then it comes back for full adoption. So just the base process is pretty lengthy. So if the committee wants staff to go ahead and begin some work on that and kind of get that process going, I don't know that it's going to, because remember, zoning, we're talking about land use. I don't know that it's going to impact what you're going to hear from emergency management, from fire, or building. Those are kind of three separate disciplines. What we're really talking about is how does this city want to permit and approve this use moving forward in the best fashion.
And my point was I don't want to wait for fire and emergency management to get started on that part of it, since it is going to be a lengthy process.
My only thought process about maybe wanting to hear from them first is, again, I think we could, if it's this committee's desire, I think we can go ahead and begin some of the research and coming up with some draft language. I think my recommendation on that last paragraph in the report and on the PowerPoint was just to make sure that we don't start down a path where we make the land use regulations overly onerous if there are building code and fire code regulations that are in place today that would allay some of those concerns that the land use considerations may take care of. So again, I think we can, if it's the committee's desire, I believe we can start that process with the understanding that you may want to give us additional direction after you hear from the fire and building code officials if you don't want us to maybe be, if you don't feel like we need to be overly restrictive based on some of those other regulations.
Got it. How do my fellow committee members feel about that approach?
I think we should proceed with getting as much information as possible to make the best decision as it relates to land use. I don't particularly want it to be an emotional decision because we've had an incident. I'd rather look comprehensively around the city. What is it we really need to do for any chemical manufacturer, storage, before we jump to, let's not allow that one to happen at that site. That, to me, is not the decision at this moment. I think we really need to be, how do we make our city safe, period? From my viewpoint, is things that have been grandfathered in. It allows certain things to go on that may be unsafe. Attorney Carmen, I did not know that, I guess we had tried to make sure that people have sprinkler systems in all buildings. And you're saying that that was an overstep on our part as the city?
It was, I think it was back in the 80s, 70s, it's some time ago, but yes.
Is that why a building like Winston Tower doesn't have sprinkler systems mandated?
I'm not sure if that's specifically why. I know that in terms of what the city tried to do, the court decided that we didn't have the authority to do it.
And so I think we need to look at how big a threat it is for any catastrophe and figure out what do we need to do for the land use issue, if that's the direction we need to go in, or is it something else? But I'd like to know more about when we overstepped.
Okay, sure. I'll be
Just
happy.
because of being safe, because I know there are other buildings that are probably could be as catastrophic. And even new buildings, like that Home Depot store in San Jose that went a horrible fire because of the things that it was storing there.
But sprinkler systems are required today. I think it
They
was just
are.
a matter of the city trying to require it for older buildings back when the lawsuit was initiated.
Which reminds me, does this building have sprinklers? I don't,
No, City Hall does not have sprinklers.
and okay, thank you very much. A potential catastrophic event. But I would think we need to be a little more comprehensive, other than just going full force with land use. I would also like to hear what the fire and emergency management might have had to say about what happened at Weaver.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes, I applaud the work done by planning staff to bring all these options forward. I think probably it's something that we can turn over to this attorney and begin parallel work and make sure that we're not overstepping with any of these and get a better handle on that before we go too much further down the road. Meanwhile, we can certainly hear from other agencies involved in this, but I think we can work on parallel tracks maybe.
I think we can. I think there are some provisions in some other ordinances from other cities that might be reasonable for us to take a look at, and that may not be problematic. I think we can start down that path and perhaps, like you said, do a parallel track while we get the information from fire and emergency management, be working on the other as well.
The staff deals with the limitations of what they're able to do with regards to the Dillon rule all the time, so they'll have,
Yeah, certainly.
they know where the guardrails are.
I'm always looking for statutory authority, and
Good.
as you all know, when we don't have it, we prepare legislation, ask the General Assembly for it.
There you go. So is everybody, committee members, all comfortable with moving forward on a parallel track, asking for land use ideas along with, or in conjunction with fire and environment? We got head nods all around?
Yes.
All right, clear as mud?
Clear.
We've got you.
Okay, thank you.
And Chairman McIntosh, maybe just a point of clarification, we had already kind of had Keith getting prepared to come to you next month. I don't know that the fire and emergency management folks are going, so just want to make sure and clarification, are we okay bringing Keith in to talk about water and air quality next month?
Yes, I'd rather have quality presentation versus having it rushed.
Okay, fair enough, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, let's move on to item G2.
Item G2, Deferred Maintenance Report Update.
This we have Mr. Royston.
Good evening, Chair McIntosh, members of the City Council.
Good evening.
Going to today provide an update on our deferred maintenance assessment that we completed back in 2018. The City of Winston-Salem, as you are aware, maintains a variety of outdoor recreational opportunities, which includes 25 basketball courts. We have over 79 parks, 17 recreation centers, several fitness trails, volleyball courts, 8 outdoor swimming pools. Next slide, please. Maintenance is a collaborative effort. Although we do have our own maintenance and operations division, we do rely on vegetation management and properties facilities management for assistance in us maintaining our park facilities and our park amenities. When we completed the deferred maintenance assessment, we concentrated on 4 focus areas. Park maintenance, which were the general core principles and things that we people have the tendency to experience when they visit our parks. Is a lot of that is a routine maintenance. We did look at pools and splash pads. They did look at a really high bird's eye view of both of our golf courses as well as our recreation centers. When the deferred maintenance assessment was completed, we found that we had $43 million worth of deferred maintenance that affected all of our parks across the city. At the time when the deferred maintenance assessment was completed, 4 parks were not included as part of that survey because they were either beginning to undergo renovations or were currently undergoing renovations. Those include Kimberly, Laughlin, the Quarry at Grant Park, and as well as Bloom. We had a total, we had a total of 13, at the time, we had a total of 13 parks that scored a B. We had 30 total that scored a C, 20 with a D rating, and 8 with an F rating at that time.
Mr. Roster,
Councilmember Sipa, yes.
the no score, the 11 parks, do you know which ones they were?
Yes. The 11 parks that were not scored were Second Street Park, because at the time, there was no existing park amenities at the time of the publication. British Woods, which is considered open space. Long Creek Park, at the time, was undergoing a master plan. Historic Pythagoras, where there was a historic site, and there's a different type of process that you must follow in terms of deferred maintenance there. West Clemensville Road is open space. Jefferson, there are no traditional park amenities. Liberty Street Park, there are no traditional park amenities. Nelson Malloy Park, there was a new park facility. We didn't do the skate park, the Gateway Nature Preserve, as well as Spring Park, which is also considered open space.
Where is the skate park?
The skate park is located at the fairgrounds,
Oh,
and it was recently installed, and there's an annual maintenance contract that we have with the installers where we ensure that that park is kept up to date. Next slide, please. Wanted to provide this map so that you can see where the parks were with their respective scores. We did break out the areas and the amounts from the 43 million in terms of in their respective wards in terms of low deferred maintenance, low to medium deferred maintenance, medium deferred maintenance, high to medium deferred maintenance, and high deferred maintenance areas. Next slide, please. At the time when, the last time I provided an update to this committee, which was in March of 2021, we had spent a total of $5.3 million, very specifically from our 2018 GO bonds that directly impacted very specific items that were stated in our deferred maintenance assessment. As of April of 2022, $11.35 million of the 2018 bonds has been allocated and spent that has been invested into our park system. Of that $11.35 million, there's little over $2.2 million invested in terms of recreation center improvements. We do have the $741,500 that was originally invested for golf course improvements, $869,000 for pool improvements, and over $7.5 million in general park improvements. I would like to note that we did receive over $719,000 from 2/3 funding that was specifically allocated for Winston Lake Golf Course. That's going to provide additional opportunities for us to continue to make improvements there at that golf course.
Mr. Rice, what was the total amount that was in the last GO bonds that was available for?
The total amount that was allocated from the GO bonds was $14.5 million. Next slide, please. We were able to work with Stewart Engineering, the firm that conducted the deferred maintenance assessment, and figure out what algorithms they used to come up with the Parcc Scores. As of March of 2019, we have those Parcc Scores there on the screen. As of January 2022, we've made significant progress. We've gone through and rescored our park facilities. We now have a total of 10 parks with a rating of A, 37 parks with a score of B, 26 parks with a score of C, one park with a score of D, and one park with a score of F. I would like to point out that the one park with a score of D is Runnymede Park, and there's already investments being made there to make improvements at that facility. But again, there are really few above-ground traditional park amenities there at that park. And the one park that is remaining that has a score of an F is Forest Park. And the reason why that park is scoring low is because of the accessibility to the park and how accessible the park is itself to persons who may have mobility impairments.
Where is that located?
Forest Park is located off of Tower Street on the southeast side of Winston. It's down Martin Luther King Drive, Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. It's also used for, we use it for an area on the roadway for overflow parking. But one of the things that also affected the score at Forest Park is that when the park was originally scored, they looked at the tennis courts and the walking trails and some amenities there that belong to the school system that typically they aren't our amenities, and that also affected the score. We typically go through at the end of each calendar year and re-rate our facilities, and so we'll do that again towards the end of this calendar year as well. Also on the map, you can see where the funding has gone in, where the invested money has gone from the 2018 bonds. A lot of the funding from our 2018 bonds has gone in those areas where it was desperately needed. But I'm happy to say that we are making progress. Next slide, please. One of the things that Stewart Engineering did not go through and rate were our greenways and trails. And this is a map that shows the Bowen Branch Trail. That particular portion of the trail had been closed for several years. In the pictures, you can see several infrastructure issues, not only with the city's infrastructure, but also with Duke Energy. And I know that we're working with the budget office to figure out, and the city manager's office to figure out some ways so that we can get this portion of the trail, as well as stormwater, to get this portion of the trail addressed and fixed. Next slide, please. And again, we do have some damage on the Muddy Creek Greenway, where we're actively trying to figure out ways that we can financially address those issues. And on the map on the right, there's the Salem Creek Trail that, for a number of reasons, I know that I've received a lot of complaints and a lot of phone calls about, but has remained underwater. And we're working with our DOT and our city county planning department to look at ways to reroute that trail so that it remains accessible and is above grade enough to the point where it does not flood, as it's continuing to do right now. To recap, out of the 2018 GO bonds, $14.5 million from the 2018 GO bonds went to address very specific needs that were in our deferred maintenance assessment. I'm happy to say that as of April of 2022, $11.35 million of those projects that money has been spent and has directly impacted the usability of several of our park systems. Again, we'll need to remain strategic in addressing items identified in our deferred maintenance assessment and invest money to improve the infrastructure at several of our facilities. The deferred maintenance assessment gave us a snapshot in time of where we were. It's a dynamic document. It's something that we're using for our future capital planning requests, and it's something that we'll continue to focus on heavily as we move forward. And at this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Questions from committee members?
I have one.
Councilmember Larson.
Thank you for this. I remember, I guess a couple of years ago, you provided us with a park-by-park evaluation of things that needed to be actually done on each site. I assume that document or some variant of that is still in your office somewhere?
Yes, Councilmember Larson, it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So my question sort of revolves around two parks. I mentioned Civitan, which is not seemingly listed in this study, and then the Bethabra Park, which you made reference to as being handled outside, but I want to make sure that they don't get lost in the discussion.
Civitan Park, we have a lease with Winston State University, and that's why the amenities at that particular facility aren't ours. We don't maintain those, the Winston State does. We are having some conversations with the board at Historic Pythagoras because there's a different type of process that we need to go through to look at the condition of all the historic buildings on the site, look at the walkways, and we're actively having conversations with them to help us fund that study. And we're working on that. We didn't forget about any facility. The study just kind of focused on the general park amenities. It didn't go into a lot of detail with recreation centers. That would be a whole nother 300-page document. But we're working with our community members and the board at Historic Pythagoras to make sure that we're addressing the needs there as well.
So can I anticipate some sort of work program for Pythagoras Park as to what their needs actually are out there now?
We're working on that. I don't think that neither myself or my staff have the skill sets that are needed to conduct that study. I think it will require hiring an outside consultant. Right now, we just don't have the funding to hire that consultant, but I also don't think that it's something that we should be funding just entirely ourselves. And so we're working with the board, and we're thinking that we will be able to work with them to be able to get a consultant on board that can go through and perform the work that's necessary to give us an idea on what we need to address and our priority list for those historic structures as well.
My understanding is that there's an assessment currently going on with the historic buildings by an outside contractor. You know anything about that?
Not one that I'm aware of.
You don't know anything about that? Well, it's important, so I appreciate you paying attention to it.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes. My first comment's going to go back to Mr. Larson's inquiry about Historic Pythagoras Park. Have we ever considered seeing if we can have that park taken over by the National Park Service?
I've never been asked that question.
I think we might want to consider it.
I think that from my point of view, the Historic Pythagoras at its core, one of the historic institutions that we have here in our city that's helped settle and help build and establish Winston-Salem as the incredible city that we are. From my understanding, I think that my staff has done a fabulous job there performing tours. The rates of visitors and special events that we host there are highly attended. If that is the wish, if you wanted for us to look at that, we could. I know that at the end of the day, I do believe that staff has done a great job. During Apple Fest, we've had 15,000 people come through that facility in one day, and that speaks volumes. And it's one of the most highly attended special events that we host across our entire park system. So.
I think the only reason I recommend that is the National Park Service is really wonderful, and the expense and maintenance of that park would fall on them. And they do manage a lot of local places, one being the George Washington Carver Museum at Tuskegee on the campus. It's run and managed by the National Park Service, so I would recommend at least looking into that possibility. It might be something that would save us a lot of money if they could take over it and restore the buildings, et cetera. It's a great way to attract tourists also. But my other question was, this report, 2018, deferred maintenance, I remember it's one of the first things I was privileged to see when I came on the council. And at that time, if I'm correct, $43 million was needed at that time. If we had it at that time, we would have been able to bring all of our parks up to par. But so far, we've only spent, we've had $14.5 million. So we know everything is going up and up and up in cost. I don't know how much it takes to figure out how much would it cost now to continue to do the maintenance on these parks. With current costs, I suspect it's going to be well over $30 million to finish it. I do want to congratulate you on the scoring, if it's accurate, that bringing up our no parks that had an A to 10 is remarkable over the short time you've been doing it. I know that many of our facilities have been rebuilt some, we've renovated others, and they are looking very good. My concern, though, is we've done that 2019, 2020, 2021. They need to be in a queue for maintenance continuously so that we're not playing catch-up. If you had your wish, how do you think we're going to get all this caught-up maintenance?
Well, we have several different strategies that we use, and one of the things is technologies continue to emerge. We find more creative ways to stretch dollars, find more creative ways to build things and to maintain them. Even more recently, we've purchased a robot that lines our soccer fields for us. It uses far less paint, there's far less waste, and it allows us to save man hours so that we can redirect that staff to other places and use our time much more wisely. And so I'm a big technology buff. I'm reading and staying up to date on current technologies and trends and things that we can do to become much more efficient. We've hired a GIS administrator that allows us to kind of look at the bigger picture much more efficiently than we ever have been before. And so we're mixing technology with creative financing and figuring out ways to do things that we probably haven't done before. And I think that through a combination of that, as we continue to move forward with this, we'll continue to make an impact and put steps in place to prevent us sliding backwards again, and that's the key. We can continue to move forward. We don't want to go backwards anymore. There were 6 of our largest parks as part of the deferred maintenance assessment accounted for 30% of the total deferred maintenance that was reported in the assessment. All of those parks have been either recently renovated or undergoing renovations, and so it's been a big help. Over the past 10 years, $60 million goes a long way in fixing things in our park system. And we're managing that with creating new things, with at the same time taking care of what we have. But we're using, me and my staff are using some very creative ways to keep us moving forward and not sliding backwards.
I'm going to do a shameless commercial. Shameless. No shame whatsoever.
Remember, I have this.
Winston Park is fabulous, and we are just waiting to open it on June the 4th. And of course, the little incidences we had a couple of weeks ago with the cars. I know you probably know we need to get the landscaping people back to fix up where we had to drive over some plants to go into the lake and put back some bollards. But beautiful, beautiful, beautiful redo of Winston Park. And we hope to invite the city to come out and celebrate that new beautiful park on June the 4th. Just shameless. It's beautiful. Just absolutely beautiful. It's so beautiful. And can you use that robot that you use for your soccer fields to paint the lines at Winston Lake football field? Can you retool it for that? If so, please do. Thank you very much.
We'll definitely consider that. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? I've got a couple questions and comments. So I'm going to say, along with the conditions of our streets and sidewalks, the conditions of our parks are the things that we, as 8 council members, consistently hear about more than anything else. And so I know it's chasing a never-ending. It's like painting a battleship. Once you finish getting to one end, you got to start and go back to the other end. And you know that every time I talk to you, my sign-off is, what do you need from me? How can I help you? the timing of this report is purposeful. We're in budget negotiations. And I want to hear from you, and I want to hear from other council people, actually not from you, but from council people, what's our dedication to keeping our stuff fixed? Year after year after year. We all love bright, shiny new parks, but then we don't want to spend the money to fix our old ones. There's a set amount of money that we can collect from the citizens of Winston-Salem before they leave town. And that money has to be divided between maintenance, salaries, and other things. So I just want to drive my point home of we need to fix our stuff rather than buy new. And I'm counting on you to let us know what you need besides just a bucket of money. I know you need that. We all know you need that. But what are other resources that we can bring to bear that can help you out? Is this a staff thing? Whatever. So, I mean, I think you've done a great job. I think we've done a lot of catch up, but I would like to get ahead of this and like you say, not backslide. So, hope council hears me loud and clear. This has got to be a priority over spending on new projects to take care of what we've got. The Greenways and Trails, that's a perpetual problem because we put them in flood zones. We put them in flood zones because that land is cheap and it's not currently developed, so it's a natural for us to want to do that, and that requires some level of coming back and fixing the same mistakes, the same problems over and over and over again, and that's just part of the deal. We're not going to move our greenways. If anything, we're going to expand them, so that's going to be part of it. So, all right, that was my soapbox. I just want everybody to hear that loud and clear, and we need to stay on this and remember when we're getting pushed from citizens to do things that are not in the budget that, in my opinion, this takes a priority, and we need to stick to that. All right, anything else from committee members? John, Mr. Larson?
Thank you. I have sort of one question that has come up periodically, and that's dealing with the rangers, park rangers, security we have on our parks.
Yes.
You have 2 paid professional rangers that...
We have 2 Winston police officers that are assigned to our park system. We currently have 1. We had 1 that retired back in September.
How many parks do we have?
79. We're adding 2 more here soon. But we also understand that there's a shortage with police officers across the city, and it's across the country for that matter. And so we've worked very closely with them. We use Ryan as almost like a liaison with the Special Operations Unit. Chief Weaver has been absolutely phenomenal in helping us, and so we're still getting the level of support. We've been able to catch 2 people that were vandalizing 2 of our major parks here within the last 2 weeks with the help of the Winston PD. So my hat's off to them. Like, I understand the struggle, but Ryan is invaluable to us. He gives us a direct line to the Winston PD, and when he needs help, he has a direct line to reach out to who he needs to reach out to make things happen for us. So we're grateful.
Manager and I have had conversations about having non-sworn officers perform some basic patrol duties. I mean, you don't ask them to do what a sworn officer with a gun can do, but just having some presence of somebody wearing a green Winston-Salem shirt out, I personally think would be helpful, and you wouldn't need a sworn officer for that. So,
Eyes on the ground.
yeah. Councilmember Scipio.
One little request. I love this report. Is it possible to prepare a report for May, where we are today, where this report takes up, for what's planned for the next year in maintenance, the allocation here that we have for...
Where the remaining money is going to...
and how we're planning to spend it.
A large portion, I can prepare that report, but a large portion of that is going to go to the renovations to the dam at Winston Lake. That portion of the project has not started yet. There's a substantial portion of the remaining funding that will go to that. But I can get you an outline of where the rest of the funding, where those facilities, where that funding will go.
Okay, and that's out of the GO bonds, the GO bonds?
Yes.
That money, and I think it looks like it's only about $3 million left.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mr. Royson, I'd ask
Thank you.
that be a quick response so that you can get to work on fixing our parks.
Sure, yes, I understand, Chair. Thank you very much.
All right. If there's nothing further, thank you very much.
Good report.
All right. Seeing nothing further, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.